This is the Open University.
Toxic masculinity is the topic of today's broadcast, and that was supposed to be a Clint Eastwood impersonation, if you hadn't noticed. You could be considered very effeminate for wearing a poncho like this, or you could be considered very frightening, Clint Eastwood-like and masculine. And I want to talk about gender stereotypes today. I think I'm going to put this hat back on. It's a huge topic for me because I've been living in a battlefield, a sort of gender battlefield. There used to be articles in the press about how I was a sexist. In about 1991, the high watermark of political correctness, someone called Betty Page wrote a piece for a magazine called Vox, long ago forgotten. Rant sexism. Momus encourages his fans to touch girls in the front row of his concerts, and all sorts of nonsense like that. I never either myself touched girls at concerts or encouraged anyone else to do so. But somehow I was fair game because the editor of The NME had decided he didn't like me at that point. And this was simply a post on which to pillory. Morrissey was being attacked at the same time for being a racist, actually quite correctly as it turns out. I was being attacked incorrectly for being a sexist. Who knows, perhaps, we all are to some degree racist, we all are sexist, and there's nothing wrong with examining that, unpacking one's baggage and seeing that these things are to some extent inevitable. And there are residues of prejudice even in people who think they're open-minded and unprejudiced. But what I was going to say actually was a footnote to a previous video where I said I was not going to buy the new MacBook Air, which I kept true to my word, I really did. And I said I was going to buy ponchos instead. And this, of course, was a typical me gesture where I was going to do something eccentric and cheap, because that's also sort of part of my core identity, that cheapness is freedom, one of my sayings, which I repeat to myself often. Either you can be free by being very wealthy, which is kind of the same thing, or you can be free by not spending much money, going to live in a cheap place, and being wealthy comparative to the people around you. Of course, there are dangers in the West, and this is where we come back to the machismo question. There are dangers with that because when you become an urban pioneer in a Western city where there are high levels of crime, high levels of anomie, high levels of maladaptation. We keep going back to these Morrissey titles, maladapted, maladjusted. You're going to be fighting a battle with the local residents who are poor people whose life is tough. And this is the crunch point, this is the crucial point, that when you live in poverty, in the West anyway, your life is generally tough and it's a struggle and you have to fight. If you notice this in the animal kingdom, that they don't use money, animals don't use money, but they do have a very similar system, which is preparedness to fight for territory. You have aggression, you have competition, you have a kind of economy based on muscle. This is the Hobbesian view of the world, that even if money didn't exist and we could all have, the same amount of no money, we would still be in a situation of competition for limited resources, and that is in itself an economic principle when you force people all to live in the same ecosystem and to be struggling for limited resources like light. Even plants, those kindly plants, they all have a struggle to reach the light, to reach the water, to put their roots down deeper, to possibly disrupt the roots of surrounding plants, and so on and so on. So, anything with limited resources becomes an economic system. Money is not the root of all evil. Roots, tree roots themselves are the roots of evil. In other words, it's all about competition and your ability and your willingness to fight for what you have. I'm the most anti-Hobbesian kind of guy, but I do admit that there are reality principles which I may not like, and one of them is that muscle does still count, or one's willingness to fight. Maybe it's to fight legally, or non-muscular ways of fighting exist, but one has to fight for what one requires, not just for what one believes in. Maybe less for what one believes in, but there are some things which one requires, and one must fight for those. So one must be threatening on some level, or macho on some level, or successful, desirous of success on some level. And that requires a semiology. And this is a kind of interesting topic for me, because coming back to this thing of the hipster, the gentrifier, the pioneer, let's say in Chicago, you find a new district in Chicago. You're one of those legendary loop line hipsters, or whatever they're called. You have a big beard, you have a coffee shop in your neighborhood where you and people like you go. Just as I have one here called Passenger. We are all passengers. They're usually run by English-speaking people here in Berlin. They're parachutees. They're people who've come in from other places and who want to make a sort of utopian community here in Berlin. The gentrification struggle here is not toxic, really. I mean, we have Turkish people who are actually keep themselves to themselves and are fine. They're not as noisy as the Germans. The problem for me this time of year is that the Germans make a hell of a lot of noise with their fireworks. The Silvesternacht is coming up on Monday night. Not looking forward to that. Already my evenings I'm jumping every 10 minutes because it sounds like there's a sort of Beirut-type explosion outside on the street, like a rocket hit the building across the road, and it's just a firework rocket. There have been actually debates in the German parliament about whether this should be banned. Because it does reveal something very disturbing about the German psyche, which is that normally, most of the year, Germans are very orderly and sort of repress their destructive urges, their kind of macho impulses, whatever it is. I think you can hear them outside even as I speak. But at Sylvester, which is the New Year's Eve, and also on May the 1st, this kind of loud thing comes out, which is all about destructiveness. And it does, these are not just regular fireworks. They're actually mixing fireworks with gunpowder, making their own homebrews, concoctions. People die every year. People get burned, they get blinded, they get their eardrums shattered. And also there is an increasingly nasty element. The people will stand on their balconies and throw, it's usually kids, throwing fireworks at passers-by, deliberately aiming them like weapons against people, just to frighten people. So I stay in, I avoid the hours of darkness on this whole weekend running up to Sylvester. I've talked about toxic desublimation before. That's when your sublimation is your disinhibition breaks through, basically, which happens when you're drunk or when you're on drugs or something. There's sort of primal urges which are part of humans, part of all animals, really, of aggression, sexuality, and also the vitality, the life urge. Those break through chemically or for whatever reason. And in some countries that's really joyous, like in Japan when they have shrine festivals or whatever. You can see there's a collective rejoicing, collective vitality, which is fantastic, usually in the summer months when they have matsuris, the Shinto festivals. And I really admire cultures which have managed to channel that aggression, that machismo, masculinity to some extent, but it's also, and also cultures which have managed to share that between the genders, not just make it a male tribal display of violence. Germany doesn't seem to have done that. What they have is this extreme contrast between very orderly and kind of well-behaved, and there's low crime here. There's really very little trouble locally. But then suddenly these sort of events which reveal a very dark underpinning, a dark underbelly to German society, where people just want to be noisy, but they also want to be aggressive, and they want to explode missiles, basically, or set cars on fire. When I first came to Berlin, the May the 1st celebration was very much an anti-capitalist demonstration, but not necessarily anti-capitalism of the left. There was also this strong anti-capitalism of the right, which, of course, the fascists played on when they were briefly in power here. You could see the fascist period actually as a kind of Silvesternacht in German history. It's that one day of the year when they actually stop sublimating and this thing comes out from underneath. I think it's something that all the Nordic races do, if I can speak racially for a moment. Bonus racist shocker. If you look at the way people drink in Scandinavia, for instance, or in Britain for that matter, they drink to really get blutered, to really get to blank out, to get smashed at the weekend, to smash other people at the weekend. There's a kind of undercurrent of desperation, nihilism, and violence to it, which you don't get in the southern, famously the southern Mediterranean countries. People are drinking their red wine with food. They're drinking en famille. The whole family has, the children have wine coupé d'eau, cut with water. And that is a good metaphor, actually, for the desublimation being benign, that you cut aggression and possessiveness, territoriality, and all the rest of it with water. Coupé d'eau. You just make it dilute, and you don't allow it to sort of accumulate and fester and then suddenly burst out just once or twice a year. This kind of disturbs me, and it doesn't. It's one of the things I like least about living in Germany. This kind of sense of threat and of toxicity, and of something subconscious. Don't get me wrong, I love the subconscious, I love the unconscious, I love a lot of primal drives and urges, and I don't think we can be fully human without them. But I think it's, as I said before, it's about how societies negotiate those, how they institutionalize them. The carnival, the Venetian carnival, for instance, was a great opportunity to let off steam. Questions are being raised in the German parliament about whether this should be banned, the sale of fireworks, the release of fireworks, especially homebrew fireworks, should be banned because it's become like a war zone. And actually the politicians are couching it now in these terms. It is a war zone every Silvesternacht. And there are injuries, there are fires all over town, people's houses burned down. Somehow in Japan they have firework displays in August, usually organized by the city councils, and they happen out on the river or something, and a lot of people put on their kimonos and they watch it from the banks. People are not so much doing their own fireworks. If they are, they're doing them on their streets with their families, usually with very small children, and their handheld sparklers and things like that. They're very scaled down. Of course, fireworks they're an Asian and Oriental tradition. I suppose I should be looking out of my window and saying, "Oh, look, another Chinese firework," but I'm not, because it's somehow a tradition which has been localized in a way I find negative and I find scary. When I first moved to Berlin, I did go out to Silvesternacht parties and things like that, and I remember getting on an underground train on the U-Bahn to go to one of these, and somebody threw a rocket. As the doors were closing, they threw a rocket into our carriage. Ha ha, isn't that funny? Look at all those people, they're having to cover their ears and stop breathing the smoke and all the rest of it. It's kind of very low-level terrorism, really, which hooligans get to have their head. This is obviously a state of affairs I'm not happy with, because I think in a much wider sense, obviously it ties in with things like football matches, football support. Disappointed to see that Rem Koolhaas is building the largest football stadium in the Netherlands. Rem Koolhaas, who started off with ideas about the clitoris and about Coney Island as New York's clitoris, who's all about sex. And now he's getting into this tribal, thuggish thing of building football stadia. Of course, all architects, I guess that's the crowning achievement of their careers. Or unless you're Zaha Hadid, in which case your tiara, which was going to be the Olympic Stadium in Japan, actually was cancelled. She was actually fired from the project after some over-cost disputes, and they have a Japanese architect now doing it. That may be racism on the Japanese part. I'm not saying Japan is a perfect culture. Maybe sexism as well on their part. But they did want to work with her, and then she apparently was difficult to work with. Can you believe it? And now she's dead, of course. She died, of a heart attack, possibly brought on by the stress of that situation. Who knows? Controversy in Moma's podcast. I was going to give you a footnote about the ponchos thing. Last week I went out and bought on Thursday I bought a MacBook, not a MacBook Air, a MacBook Pro, the 13-inch one, and I have to say, I was saying that aesthetically it wasn't exciting to me to buy a new computer, but I have to say that there is a beautiful creaminess to the screen. It's my first Retina screen, and now my old MacBook Air looks very gritty. When I look at it, there's a kind of textural, pixely kind of quality which I don't miss at all. Obviously looking at the milky greys. Also, as someone who wears a lot of grey and appreciates the milkiness of different shades of grey, I don't know why I use that word milky, but there's a certain warmth in greys which you can achieve, and then you can put in tactical and topical splashes of colour, like I'm doing with this poncho. Yeah, I was going to say that I posed a false dichotomy in one of these videos earlier in the year, which was that I would rather buy second-hand books and ponchos than a new computer, and I didn't want to tithe my annual revenue to Apple. I've tithed, I've given the world's richest company my 1,700 euros. But it wasn't either or. On the same day I went to Humana on Alexanderplatz. I bought the machine on Alexanderplatz in MediaMarkt, actually, which is good. They had a reduction on this machine. I guess nobody's buying these Apple laptops now. Everyone's like me saying, what the hell, I'm not very excited about this. But I went to Humana and I got a couple of woolen items, and those really excite me. And I could look potentially very effeminate in a poncho, because women make these for a start. This is handmade, but also women, I guess, tend to wear them, unless you're super macho and you're Clint Eastwood, in which case it's the kind of floppy, loose clothing that can conceal a weapon. You could have a little pistol in here. You could have a knife in there. You could have all sorts of things. There's the thing about loose and floppy clothes. They can be the most macho clothes ever, because everyone's sort of into the tight trousers and all the rest of it now. But I think the future is floppy. That's probably a good place to leave this. I haven't really spoken much about gender politics, but that's because I think all that stuff is kind of a distraction. I'm into class politics. I think class politics is the only thing we should really be thinking about, and equality and issues like that. But when it comes down to small categories, for instance, I was looking at there was a review of the year on Dezeen where they talked about the future university, the floating university, where I did a little talk about Japan in September, for instance, as one of the year's most interesting architectural projects, unfortunately dismantled now. But they were also talking about a group in London of black architects, female black architects, who were meeting, and whose main topic was to have diversity recognised more in architecture circles. There was also a shit list circulated of architects. I think these initiatives are tragic. I think as long as when you focus on a group of black architects, black women architects, you only talk about them in the context of there being black women architects. That is already failure. You have to be. I'm absolutely delighted, 150% delighted to see a black woman architect making a great project and being celebrated as an architect. What I don't want to see is the article about her just harping on about how she is a black architect and hasn't she done well, because that's a very difficult thing to be. That is the glass ceiling. That is the new version of the glass ceiling, is that in every single interview, all you can ever talk about is your identitarian issue. We should be beyond that by now. And if we're not beyond that, let's get beyond that by not foregrounding identity when we talk about people, even when that might seem like a significant topic to talk about in articles. I'd much rather talk about the much deeper issues of what is the culture of women. If you're celebrating women being architects, what is it about Zaha Hadid's buildings that was female? I mean, you could easily look at that design center she made in Seoul and say, well, it's very curvy. It is very rounded, and it's sort of a beautiful organic shape, and maybe there is something. And then, of course, you get accused of essentialism, saying, there is an essential feminine quality to rounded curves, and of course then you can cite all the exceptions where men actually, men have rounded knees, so you can't actually say that's essentially feminine. Bullshit. Of course our culture recognizes that rounded things, right back to thousands of years ago, where you found mysterious fertility symbols of women pregnant women with huge bellies. I mean, that rounded form has been associated with fertility, with pregnancy, with creativity. I could go on, but I don't want to see identity foregrounded as the only thing significant about someone who seems to come from an unusual identity. And the same with gender and with, I think it's a blind alley. I really do. I think we should be talking about the deeper, not ignoring those elements at all, but saying, okay, so if you are an African architect, what is it about the African environment which has formed the way you make architecture? Go into those topics by all means, but don't just say, isn't it great, this guy's an African architect. I think that's all I have to say now, except I'm going to shoot you as Clint Eastwood. I'm going to show how to pull a pistol out of here. Where did I put my cigarillo? Here it is. I think I'm going to go off and smoke this quietly.
Open University.